The fluorescent lights of Seattle General's ICU hum their mechanical lullaby at 1900 hours, a sound like electricity trapped in glass tubes, and Brooke Sullivan moves through the space with the kind of invisibility that takes years to perfect. She doesn't hurry. She doesn't pause to check her reflection in the medication cart's polished steel. She simply exists in the margins of other people's attention, a body in teal scrubs, a name badge that reads B. Sullivan RN, a presence so unremarkable that the attending physicians rarely make eye contact when they pass. The smell of antiseptic hangs thick, that sharp, chemical bite that lives in every hospital from San Antonio to Seattle, bleach mixed with floor wax and the faint metallic undertone of blood that never quite washes away. She's been at Seattle General for 8 months now, long enough to know which nurses take their breaks in the supply closet and which ones actually eat lunch, long enough to know that Dr. Pierce likes his coffee at exactly 6:22 a.m. and that the ventilators in the North Wing all have a slight wheeze on the exhalation cycle. 8 months is long enough to disappear completely. Room 4's monitor displays a rhythm that makes her pause for exactly 1 second. 2:13 a.m. in Helmand Province feels like 30 seconds ago, feels like yesterday, feels like it might never stop feeling like now. The colonel lies in the hospital bed with the kind of stillness that comes from training your body not to flinch at pain, his chest rising and falling in sync with the ventilator's mechanical breath, his left leg immobilized in a frame that keeps the femur fracture stable. She has not let herself look at his face directly. She has not allowed her eyes to linger. But muscle memory is a merciless thing, and her hands know this man's vital signs the way a sniper knows the weight of her rifle, intimate and certain. The central line runs from his right subclavian artery, a 14-gauge catheter that someone placed with competence but not elegance, and when she inspects the site her fingers move with the precision of someone who has threaded fours in darkness under fire, who has pressure-dressed wounds while rounds were still landing, whose training lives in her bones like a second heartbeat. She logs the vitals in the electronic medical record with perfect penmanship, blood pressure 128/78, heart rate 72, O2 saturation 98% on a modest amount of supplemental oxygen, core temperature 36.9, numbers that tell the story of a strong man recovering slowly from trauma. The folder in her pocket presses against her ribs like a weight, though it weighs almost nothing. The flag inside is folded into that rigid triangle the way it should be, the way she carried it out of Helmand Province 3 years ago when the Pentagon decided that Captain Brooke Sullivan needed to stop existing. When they ordered her to vanish. He doesn't announce himself. Dr. Pierce enters room for the way he enters most spaces, with the expectation that his presence will reorganize the room around his importance, and Brooke doesn't look up from the medication cart, doesn't change the rhythm of her movements, doesn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledgement. She has learned to be a shadow in his presence, to absorb his scrutiny without reflecting it back. But she feels his eyes on her hands as she draws up 5 milliliters of heparin flush in a syringe, the needle thin and precise, the plunger smooth under her thumb. She feels him watching as she swabs the catheter port with chlorhexidine, a motion so economical it looks almost lazy, and as she injects the flush with the kind of gentle pressure that keeps air from forming pockets in the line. The hiss of medication flowing through the catheter is barely audible, but in the careful silence of the ICU it sounds like a sigh. Dr. Pierce is a man who has built his authority on 3 decades of spotless credentials and a face that photographs well for hospital newsletters, a man whose power comes from the kind of institutional momentum that allows him to dismiss nurses without ever raising his voice. What he is watching for right now is incompetence. What he will not see is the reason that incompetence is impossible. The colonel's brother arrives at 19:30 hours, moving through the ICU doors with the kind of exhausted caution that family members develop after spending 6 hours on a plane, after being told that your sibling crashed his Black Hawk helicopter 2 weeks ago and survived, after learning he's been in the ICU at Seattle General since the emergency surgery that saved his life. The man is Delta Force himself. She can read it in the way he carries his shoulders, in the brief assessment he makes of the room before sitting, in the calluses on his hands that match the calluses on her own. He settles into the visitor's chair and doesn't speak, just reaches out and places his hand on his brother's foot, a gesture that requires no words. Brooke moves quietly around the monitors, adjusting the 4 pump rate, checking the Foley catheter output, documenting everything in the kind of obsessive detail that looks like conscientious nursing but is actually the muscle memory of someone who has learned that precision keeps you alive. She works the outer edges of the room. She keeps her body angled so that her face remains peripheral. She becomes a function rather than a person. When the brother looks up from his vigil, she is already moving toward the door, already transitioning to room 3, where Mrs. Chen is recovering from a pneumonia that tried to kill her last week. Mrs. Chen doesn't recognize excellence when she sees it. Most people don't. But Dr. Pierce is still standing near the medication cart when Brooke returns from room 3, and for a moment, just a moment, the fluorescent lights catch his expression differently. She sees the exact instant when he calculates something, when he files away an observation, when he decides that the unremarkable nurse in the teal scrubs might warrant paying attention to. The calculation happens in his eyes. The decision happens in the small set of his jaw. He has begun the arithmetic of looking at her, and she knows what that means. She knows what it means when someone competent starts to notice you. When someone powerful begins to suspect that you might be something other than what your name badge suggests. The intercom crackles from the ceiling, attention ICU, blood product available at the lab. Type O negative. First call, first served. The announcement echoes across the unit, ordinary and immediate, and Brooke is already moving toward the lab door, already part of the machinery that keeps the hospital running. She doesn't look back at Dr. Pierce. She doesn't need to. She can feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing, like pressure changing in the air before a storm, and she knows with absolute certainty that everything that has happened in the past 8 months, the invisibility, the forgetting, the careful construction of ordinariness, has just started to unravel. What she doesn't know yet is that his attention is not curiosity. It's threat assessment. And he has already decided that someone who moves with that kind of precision is someone who needs to be stopped before she becomes a problem. Dr. Pierce's voice cut across room 4 at 2100 like a blade through silence. This is why we don't let undertrained staff handle critical cases. You've contaminated the central line port again. The colonel's brother stood frozen in the corner, his tired eyes widening. Brooke kept her gaze on the 4 line, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as she methodically swabbed the port with chlorhexidine. She hadn't contaminated anything. They both knew it. But Pierce was already reaching for fresh tubing, making a deliberate show of redoing her flawless work while the resident and the colonel's brother watched. Some nurses, Pierce said, his clinical tone dripping condescension, haven't developed the muscle memory for aseptic technique yet. It comes with experience. He threaded the new line with exaggerated precision, every movement a performance. Butterfingers here will get there eventually. Maybe. He smiled at the colonel's brother. We just need to ensure patient safety in the meantime. Brooke's hands didn't shake. Her pen moved in perfect straight lines across the patient chart as she documented the line change Pierce had just made unnecessary. The chlorhexidine smell, that sharp, clean hospital chemical, hung in the air between them like a challenge. She could feel Pierce's eyes on her face, waiting for something. A tremor. A flush of embarrassment. The mask slip. She gave him nothing but the steady sound of her pen against paper, the soft scrape of ballpoint on medical record. An hour later, the ICU fell into its 2200 rhythm, the ventilators wheezed their mechanical cadence, monitors beeped in staggered arrhythmias, and the fluorescent lights buzzed their constant electric hum. Brooke pushed through the break room door carrying her dinner in a paper bag. 3 nurses sat at the table, Sarah from the day shift, Miguel from the residence team, and Chen, the charge nurse she'd worked beside for 8 months without incident. Their chairs scraped loud against the tile floor as they all stood simultaneously. No words. No explanation. They grabbed their lunches and left, the door swinging shut behind them with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like the room itself exhaling in relief. Brooke unwrapped her sandwich alone at the table. The bread was slightly stale. She ate mechanically, her eyes moving across the break room to the bulletin board where staff announcements hung in rigid rows. That's when she saw it. A disciplinary notice pinned dead center, her name in bold capitals, Brooke Sullivan, 3rd violation, improper medication handling. She stood and walked to the board without finishing her meal. The notice was dated that morning. The details were fabricated with surgical precision: a supposed morphine count discrepancy during her shift last Tuesday, a pharmacy callback about a mislabeled dose, a patient complaint she'd never heard about. Every detail false. Every word calculated. She read it twice, her face a mask of composure, and when she turned, Pierce stood in the doorway watching her reaction like a predator measuring prey. She threw her untouched sandwich in the trash and returned to her patients. The next morning at 0615, Pierce intercepted her at the nurse's station in full view of the day shift. His voice was pure clinical concern, the kind that makes witnesses believe the concern is genuine. "Brooke, we need to discuss your pattern of unsafe practices before someone gets hurt." He held a tablet displaying pharmaceutical logs she'd never seen before. "These discrepancies in the narcotic count all trace back to your shifts. The pharmacy is very concerned." She met his eyes. Said nothing. Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign that her silence bothered him more than any defensive response would have. He mistook her composure for defeat. "I'm documenting this conversation," he continued, "and I'll need you to sign an acknowledgement of this concern. We may need to put you on administrative leave pending an investigation." "When?" Her voice was flat. Conversational. "Friday," he said. "End of shift. That gives you 4 days to get your affairs in order." She nodded once and walked past him to her patients. But her mind was cataloguing timestamps now. Billy codes that didn't match Seattle General's system. Pharmaceutical orders filed under her patient names but consumed in Pierce's cases. She'd caught fragments of the pattern yesterday: phantom billing codes, medication quantities that didn't align with actual patient treatment. Now the shape of it became clearer. Pierce was diverting narcotics. High-grade pharmaceuticals. And he needed her gone because she moved with the precision of someone trained to notice inconsistencies. Someone whose hands knew exactly what belonged in and for port and what didn't. Someone who could read a room's chemical composition and see what didn't fit. She spent her lunch hour in the supply room, pulling inventory records from the past 6 months. The pattern repeated like a heartbeat. June 15th, 50 cubic centimeters morphine ordered for a post-op patient under Pierce's name. The patient chart showed 30 cubic centimeters administered. 20 cc unaccounted for. July 3rd, 100 milligrams fentanyl for critical care. 60 consumed in patient care. 40 missing. August 19th, 3 vials of pharmaceutical-grade propofol. 2 administered. 1 absent from every audit trail. The door opened. Pierce's physician assistant appeared in the doorway, her expression apologetic. "Dr. Pierce needs you off the Colonel's case. You're being reassigned to post-surgical recovery effective immediately." Brooke nodded. She tucked the inventory records back on the shelf and left without a word. She didn't photograph them. Not yet. That would come later, after she understood what Pierce was doing with 40 milliliters of morphine at a time. By midnight, the reassignment was official. A new nurse, Patterson, one of Pierce's loyal cohort, took over room 4. Brooke stood at her new station in post-surgical recovery, watching the monitors, her hand steady as surgical lasers even as the calculation happened behind her eyes. Pierce had given her 4 days to disappear. For days before administrative leave became termination. For days before a fabricated pattern of incompetence followed her to the next hospital, and the next, until no one would hire her at all. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the Colonel. In Helmand Province, that man had led her son's unit through the Sanjan Valley, through 37 days of ambush and dust and choices that still haunted men's sleep. And Pierce knew, somehow, impossibly, Pierce knew there was a connection there. Why else reassign her the moment the Colonel's brother mentioned a name in the hallway? Brooke checked the time on her phone, 0047. 3 days and 23 hours until end of shift Friday. 3 days and 23 hours until Pierce completed his dismantling of her existence. She destroyed her cover to save the Colonel's life. Now she had to decide if she was going to let the man who was stealing narcotics from critical care patients walk away clean. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby. The post-operative monitor beeped its steady rhythm. And Brooke Sullivan, captain of the 75th Ranger Regiment, sat very still and began to think about what came next. The hallway outside room smelled like antiseptic and something else, the particular staleness of a man who hadn't slept in 36 hours. Brooke noticed it the moment Colonel Marcus Webb's brother rounded the corner at 2300, his eyes red-rimmed and searching. She'd been checking the 4-pump on room 6, her movements deliberate and slow, the kind of busy that kept her visible but unremarkable. The brother stopped in front of her. His name was David. She'd learned that from the visitor log. He was a contractor from Spokane, and his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the ICU unit. "You're the one," he said. Not a question. Brooke didn't look up from the pump. She adjusted the infusion rate with her index finger, precise and unhurried. The fluorescent lights above cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made people look like ghosts. She'd learned long ago that silence was a more powerful response than words. It made people fill the space with their own need to communicate. It was a tactic she'd used in interrogation rooms in Paktia province. It worked here too. Marcus told me, David continued, his voice dropping. Before the surgery, before they sedated him. He said there was a nurse here. That you served. Helmand. He said you were there when. His voice cracked slightly. When my son's unit came through. When they needed help. That wasn't the colonel's medication pump. Brooke realized this and moved to room 7 instead, where Mrs. Chen's heart medication was actually due. Her hands moved on their own, 23 years of practice, muscle memory running parallel to the conversation happening above her head. She'd served in Helmand province for 14 months, from April 2009 through June 2010. The colonel had been a major then, leading 3rd Battalion out of FOB Shank. Her son's unit would have been Charlie Company, 1st Platoon, if she was remembering the roster correctly. Which she was. She remembered every roster. Your son was Charlie Company, Brooke said quietly, finally looking at David's face. His eyes widened slightly at the confirmation. 1st Platoon. Their medic took shrapnel on a patrol outside Sanjin Valley. IED buried under a culvert. She paused, letting the memory settle between them like a physical thing. Your son applied pressure while I set and 4. Stayed calm. That took training. And character. David's hand came up to his mouth. His shoulders shook once, a single convulsion of grief that he caught and controlled. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. He didn't come home. The next month, on a routine supply run. Convoy got hit. Brooke's jaw tightened. She knew this already. She'd kept files on certain people, certain outcomes, certain names that had mattered. It was a vulnerability she shouldn't maintain, a file she shouldn't have accessed after she'd been ordered to vanish. But she had. She always did. She said nothing now because there was nothing to say that would change anything. The pump clicked. The 4 dripped. The world continued. Thank you, David whispered. For being there. For trying. Brooke inclined her head once. A gesture, not acceptance. She couldn't accept his gratitude without claiming credit for something that had ultimately failed. The boy had died anyway. The medic training, the calm under fire, the 4 she'd set with a needle borrowed from the surgical kit, none of it had mattered in the end. That was the mathematics of Helmand province. That was the mathematics of war. You did everything right and people died anyway. She moved to the next patient's room, and David didn't follow. She heard his footsteps recede toward the waiting area, toward chairs that had absorbed the tears of 1,000 families waiting to learn whether their loved ones would live or die. Brooke kept her eyes forward. She would not think about the boy's face. She would not think about the folder in her apartment, 3 miles south, hidden in the back of her closet behind a winter coat she'd never worn. She would not think about anything except the next 4 pump, the next vital sign, the next shift that would eventually end and give her 6 hours to sleep and then begin again. At 01 for 5, the monitor in room 4 lit up like a warning flag. Brooke saw it from across the unit. She was at Station 3, documenting Mrs. Chen's latest round of labs, and her eyes caught the telemetry display even though she wasn't meant to be watching. Wasn't meant to be thinking about the Colonel's vitals. Wasn't meant to care. The numbers on that screen dropped from a stable 94 to 87 in a span of seconds. Then 79. The saturation line dipped like a descending aircraft. Someone should have noticed. Should have moved. Should have called. The new nurse assigned to room 4, a girl named Sophie who'd been with Seattle General for 6 months and had never managed a critical patient without supervision, stood frozen at the medication cart. Brooke could see her from the angle of the station, could see the way Sophie's hands hovered over a medication drawer she hadn't yet opened. The girl was staring at her phone. Checking the time. Probably thinking about the paper she had due for her online nursing degree. Thinking about anything except the patient whose oxygen saturation was now 74 and falling like a stone. The alarm chirped. Not urgent yet. But getting there. Sophie. Brooke's voice carried the exact tone that demanded immediate action, but she kept the volume low. Command voice without making it obvious she was commanding. Room 4. Check your monitor. Sophie looked up. Looked at her screen. Her eyes widened. She turned and moved toward the patient room, then stopped. Hesitated. Looked back at Brooke as if unsure whether she was actually permitted to intervene or if this was some kind of test. The oxygen saturation ticked down to 71. Brooke stood. Not running. Not urgent in appearance. Just moving with the kind of fluid efficiency that made people unconsciously step aside. She was 3 steps toward room 4 when the charge nurse, a woman named Patricia who'd worked Seattle General for 17 years and understood Pierce's politics perfectly, moved into her path. You're not on his case, Sullivan. Patricia's voice was pleasant. Conversational. The tone made it worse. Step back. Brooke stopped. She was close enough to see the monitor now, close enough to watch the Colonel's blood pressure slide sideways. It was starting to look like hypovolemic shock. Like someone had given him something they shouldn't have. Like someone had ordered a medication that would tank his pressure when his body was already running on reserves. His O2 is dropping. That's a staffing issue. That's not assignment-based. Call for Pierce, Patricia said, still in that pleasant voice, turning toward Sophie. Tell him we need him in room 4. Sophie pulled her phone. Dialed with fingers that shook slightly. Spoke in the small voice of someone who knew they'd made a mistake and was hoping the mistake wouldn't cost them their job. Brooke watched the monitor ticking downward. 68, 66. The heart rate was climbing to compensate, 146, 152, and that was the telltale sign of a body in distress, burning its own reserves because oxygen wasn't making it to the lungs. Something was wrong with the ventilator settings. Or the tubing. Or the medication just administered. Dr. Pierce arrived in surgical scrubs, irritated, pulling the fabric away from his wrist as if contamination was already happening. He'd been called out of an elective procedure, Brooke had heard the page, and his displeasure was evident in the sharp way he moved toward the patient room. He examined the Colonel with the kind of theatrical thoroughness that was designed to be observed, to be noted, to be appreciated. He checked the ventilator. Adjusted the FiO2 percentage up to 100%. Checked the medication log. His eyes flicked across the documentation, and Brooke saw the moment he registered what had happened. Saw him realize that someone had administered a medication that would drop blood pressure in a patient who couldn't afford the drop. And then she saw him make the decision to do nothing about it. Medication adjustment, Pierce said aloud, speaking to the room instead of directly to Sophie. The patient is becoming dependent on high supplemental oxygen. Reduce the FiO2 back to 40%. He needs to work a bit. Build his own respiratory drive. He made notations in the chart, his handwriting swift and authoritative. Then, call if anything changes. I've got a procedure waiting. He left. The scrub fabric settled back against his shoulders. His footsteps echoed down the hallway with the confidence of a man who'd just made a clinical decision that would be impossible to question. High FiO2 dependency was a real phenomenon. Some physicians believed in weaning patients back to lower oxygen levels to encourage them to breathe harder. It sounded reasonable if you didn't understand that the Colonel was already crashing. Brooke returned to Station 3. Saturday. She opened Mrs. Chen's chart and began documenting vitals that had been taken 20 minutes earlier. She made her notes precise and timely, creating the appearance of being exactly where she was supposed to be, exactly as engaged as she was supposed to be. From her position at the station, she could see Room 4's monitor. She could watch the numbers as they continued their descent. She could see Sophie standing awkwardly in the hallway, uncertain whether to intervene or defer to the attending physician's orders. Patricia was at the other end of the unit, reviewing medication administration records, deliberately not watching the monitor. The clock on the wall showed 0155. Then 0200. Brooke documented. She checked her own patient's vitals. She restocked the supply cart by the medication refrigerator. She stayed visible and present and useless. This was what it meant to be a nurse without authority. This was what it meant to wear the uniform of someone who had no power to stop what was coming. At 0200, during what should have been nothing more than a routine dressing change, the Colonel's monitor flatlined. Not technically flatline. Not asystole. But close enough, a chaotic rhythm that the heart monitor struggled to interpret. The alarm screamed. This was the urgent alarm, the one that meant immediate intervention. Sophie's voice cracked as she called for assistance, her fingers fumbling for the crash cart. Patricia was moving now, fast, pulling the defibrillator pads from the drawer. The resident, a third-year named Dr. Jacobson who was competent but not calm, rushed into the room and immediately reached for the fall-line to push medications. But his hands were shaking. He couldn't get vascular access. The Colonel's veins had collapsed. The fluid balance was gone. The entire system was shutting down because of the medication combination, because of Pierce's deliberate underoxygenation, because of 14 hours of subtle sabotage designed to ensure the Colonel would crash on the night shift when Brooke wasn't assigned, when she couldn't save him, when her presence was officially prohibited. Brooke stood. Didn't move. Watched. Patricia was calling for Pierce. No answer. The overhead paging system crackled, and Patricia's voice went out across the entire hospital. Code Blue, ICU, Room 4. Code Blue. The Colonel's chest heaved once as the resident attempted manual compressions with technique that was sloppy, too fast, ineffective. The sound was wet and desperate, ribs compressing fluid instead of moving. The room had become chaos in the way that hospital codes always did, people moving without coordination, medications being drawn up without clear orders, the crash cart being positioned and repositioned because no one had a clear plan. This was what happened when a code team wasn't prepared. When the attending wasn't present. When the patient had been abandoned. Brooke walked to the supply room. Opened the cabinet where the surgical kits were stored. Found the trauma shears, stainless steel, worn smooth from 100 hands, engraved with a unit call sign she'd paid someone in Tacoma to add 3 years ago. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. She thought about David Webb's trembling hands. She thought about a boy who'd stayed calm under fire and died anyway in a convoy ambush. She thought about the Colonel who'd been a major then and a legend now and a man who deserved better than this. She cut open her scrub top. She put on the mask that covered the lower half of her face. She moved the trauma shears into her pocket and walked back to room 4 like someone moving through water, like someone who'd already accepted the consequences, like someone who had nothing left to lose. The next words out of her mouth changed everything. Step aside. Now. The command cuts through the ICU like a blade. Brooke's already moving, not running, something worse, something that makes the code team part like water before a ship's bow. Her voice isn't the deferential whisper from this morning. It's a voice that's ordered men into fire. It's a voice that's held the line when the line was breaking. She's at the bedside before anyone registers she's moved. The colonel's chest isn't rising. His monitor is a flat, accusatory line. The resident is still stammering about protocols, about the chain of command, about the fact that she's not even assigned to this patient anymore, but Brooke's already straddling the bed, her hands finding the sternum with the precision of someone who's done this 1,000 times in conditions far worse than climate-controlled rooms. Her palms compress down with force that cracks ribs, not delicate, not the textbook 1,500-gram pressure they teach in nursing school. This is field medicine. This is what keeps a man alive when the medevac is 30 minutes out. 1, 2, 3, 4. The chest moves under her hands like she's pumping a manual hydraulic. Blood oxygen climbing on the monitor even though there's no pump, no machine, just Brooke's hands and a year of cardiac physiology and 8 years of keeping people alive in places where the only equipment available was whatever you were carrying. Epinephrine. Push 2 milligrams for. She doesn't request it. She calls it like a command because it is one. The scrub tech moves without thinking. The resident scrambles for the crash cart. Someone's bagging the colonel now, oxygen hissing into the mask with the sound of a train brake releasing. I need a thoracotomy tray. 2 units O negative. Vascular clamp. Now. The room stops. A thoracotomy in the ICU. A thoracotomy in a bed with nothing but monitors and a ventilator and a nurse who isn't supposed to be here. The scrub tech stares. We don't have. Then get me a scalpel. Her hands don't stop compressing. Her voice doesn't waver. Move. Nobody moves. The attending is somewhere else, always somewhere else when you need him. The resident is frozen, his code card still in his pocket. The charge nurse is making a phone call, probably to someone, probably about something, probably to someone who can tell her what to do because nobody here knows how to answer to a voice like this anymore. Brooke's hand slides down to her trauma shears in her pocket. No. Not the shears. Something else. Something she promised herself 3 years ago she would never use again. The combat knife is 9 inches of stainless steel with a wrapped leather handle stained dark from things she won't remember if she tries hard enough. She's carried it every day for 36 months. Under her scrubs. Against her ribs. A whisper of weight that reminds her who she is when she's pretending to be someone else. She pulls it free. The room changes. The air pressure shifts like a storm system rolling in fast. Someone gasps. Someone else backs up. The resident's face goes the color of ICU tile. What the? No time. The incision is precise, under the left breast, between the ribs, her hands moving with muscle memory that predates her nursing license by a decade. The knife is sharp, surgical sharp, and her hands are steady as a mechanical drill. The skin opens. The muscle separates. Blood wells but not too much, not yet, because what she's about to do next will solve that problem or create a much larger one. The ribs. 2 fingers inside the chest cavity now, the knife working through the intercostal space, spreading the sternum open like she's reading a book written in anatomy. The colonel's heart is there in the surgical field, pale and flaccid and not beating. That needs to change. She's calling orders. Direct cardiac massage. Both hands inside the chest now, the colonel's heart between her palms, real compression, the kind you can't teach from a textbook because no textbook is permitted to describe what it feels like to hold someone's life between your bare hands while it's literally in your hands. Suction. Clamp the bleeders. Get me another unit. Someone's moving now. Everyone's moving. The ICU has transformed into something stranger than a hospital, it's become a forward operating base, and Brooke is the only person here who knows how to work. Nurses are scrambling, handing her instruments, their faces pale and shocked because what they're watching isn't medicine as they've been taught it. It's emergency surgery performed by someone whose hands move like they've been doing this since before they learned to tie their shoes. The colonel's heart flutters under her palm. Just a quiver, a ghost of a beat, but it's there. Again. Push another milligram epi. Come on, sir. The heart contracts. Once. Again. The monitor changes from flat death to a rhythm that isn't sinus but it's rhythm, it's life, it's something the body can build on. Brooke's left hand stays inside the chest, holding the clamp, holding the pressure, holding the line while her right hand works blood products and medication, and the sheer force of will that's kept her alive through 7 years the army didn't teach her officially happened. His pressure's coming up. 80/60. 90/70. The fluorescent lights hum their flat mechanical song. The ventilator wheezed its rhythm. The heart monitor clicks out a cadence that sounds almost normal now, almost human, almost like a man who's supposed to stay alive is going to stay alive. Brooke is still inside the colonel's chest cavity when the doors to the ICU burst open. Dr. Pierce enters at 0210, 10 minutes after the code began, his white coat perfect and his hair perfect and his face perfect right up until he sees what's happening in front of him. His expression rotates through confusion, then shock, then rage with the precision of a clock hand moving through numbers. What the hell are you doing? He's alive. Pierce moves closer, his jaw working, his eyes locked on her bare hands, inside another human being's chest. He's calling for security already, reaching for his phone, his voice shifting from shock to something clinical and controlled and far more dangerous than anger. Step back from the patient. No. Step back. Now. That's an order. Brooke's eyes don't leave the monitor. Her hands don't stop moving. Step aside, Dr. Pierce. Cardiothoracic needs access. Call them. But Pierce is already backing away, his phone up to his ear, his voice modulating to the tone of someone reporting a critical incident, security to ICU. Stat. We have an unstable staff member. Armed. Patient assault. Possible weapon. The security guards arrive before the surgical team. 2 of them, young, trained in hospital protocols, not prepared for what they're walking into. A woman with her hands inside another human's chest. Blood on her scrubs. A knife on the instrument tray. We're going to need you to step back from the patient. Not yet. The charge nurse is beside her now, pale but present, still assisting because the patient is still dying and protocols don't matter when the alternative is death. Pressure's holding. 110/75. Brooke finally steps back. Her hands are shaking. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint, the restraint of someone who's about to be arrested for saving a life. The surgical team arrives in a cascade of running feet and urgent voices. Brooke yields the patient with the precision of a soldier standing down, her hands still inside the chest for one more second, long enough to whisper something the monitor won't record, something only the colonel would hear if he were awake. We're not done, sir. Not yet. Then she's stepping back, stepping away, stepping into the hands of security while Dr. Pierce's voice continues its clinical monologue into his phone, each word carefully chosen to destroy what he's watching happen right in front of him. She brought a weapon to work. She's unstable. She's a danger to patients. Yes, I have witnesses. By 02:30, hospital security escorts Brooke through the corridors of Seattle General while she's still wearing the colonel's blood on her scrubs, still carrying the knife in the bag that security hasn't confiscated yet because Pierce was careful to have her removed before the chain of custody became an issue. By 0300, she's sitting in the back of a security office while Pierce makes phone calls with the precision of someone dismantling a house of cards, calls to the hospital administrator, to the state nursing board, to the Seattle Police Department. His voice on the phone is calm. Professional. Concerned. He speaks of psychiatric breaks and weapons in the workplace and the terrible tragedy of a staff member who snapped under pressure. Each sentence is constructed to be irrefutable. Each accusation is a fact when delivered by someone with 20 years of unblemished credentials and the confidence of a man who's never been questioned. By 0400, Brooke is sitting in an all-night diner 7 blocks east, the kind of place where the coffee's always hot and the questions never come. The vinyl booth is cracked under her thighs. Her scrubs are still wet with blood that isn't hers. The folded flag from Marcus Sullivan's memorial service is in her jacket pocket, pressed flat against her heart like a stone, like a promise, like the weight of every choice that led her here. She's staring out the black window at the San Antonio night when her phone buzzes. A news alert. St. Jude's Memorial, the hospital's official name, always formal even in crisis, ICU patient in critical condition following alleged staff assault. Investigation ongoing. The coffee's gone cold. She reaches for it anyway, and that's when everything changes. The vinyl booth was the color of old blood, cracked at the seams where 1,000 cups of spilled coffee had dried into permanent stains. Brooke sat motionless in the booth's corner, her shoulders against the wall where she could see the entrance and the kitchen and the parking lot beyond, old habits running deeper than civilian life ever could. Her scrubs were still damp from the surgical theater, still carrying the ghost smell of antiseptic and something darker that she wouldn't let herself name. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, a brown ring forming at the waterline where the ceramic had absorbed the heat and given it back to nothing. The diner was empty except for a night clerk who'd stopped asking if she needed anything after the second refusal. Rain hammered the windows like applause for someone else's victory, and Brooke stared at her reflection in the black glass, a woman with wet hair plastered to her skull, eyes that had seen field medicine performed on the worst cases and won anyway, hands that had cracked open a man's chest with a knife that wasn't surgical steel. The reflection stared back like a stranger. Like a ghost. Like someone who died 6 months ago and just didn't know it yet. The folded flag was still in her jacket pocket, the fabric worn soft from 3 years of carrying it like a prayer that wouldn't take. Her son's flag, given to her by officers who didn't know she'd trained the man who'd led his unit through Helmand Province. Given to her at a funeral where she couldn't cry because crying was exposure, and exposure was the end of everything. She'd pressed it flat against her chest every night for 36 months, pressed it the way you'd press a wound closed, trying to keep something from bleeding out. And now Pierce had stolen her identity, dismantled her entire existence in a single shift, left her sitting in a diner at 0313 hours in the morning with nothing but a rumpled uniform and a flag that felt like a promise she'd failed to keep. Security had escorted her out within an hour of the code. 2 guards she didn't recognize, their radios crackling with hospital codes that meant nothing to her anymore because she wasn't a nurse now, she was a threat. They'd walked her to the employee exit, the one by the pharmacy loading dock, their hands never touching her but the message implicit in their positioning, "You are not welcome here." Behind them, she could hear Dr. Pierce's voice, smooth as surgical tape, explaining to the hospital administrator how an unstable nurse with an unknown background had assaulted a patient with a weapon. How she'd endangered the entire ICU. How the hospital was lucky nothing worse had happened. How he'd documented her concerning behavior for weeks. How he'd done everything right. How he was the victim. Brooke had said nothing. She'd walked out with her hands empty and her jaw locked, watching the security cameras track her exit the way Pierce had surely planned it, every angle recording her shame, her failure, her end. No one had asked about the patient. No one had asked how the colonel's chest cavity was doing. No one had asked why his heart had suddenly stopped during a routine dressing change, why the code team had frozen like they'd been trained wrong, why the medications in his line weren't the ones the chart said he'd been prescribed. They'd only asked why she'd taken a combat knife to a surgical theater and performed a field procedure that wasn't in any hospital protocol. The coffee was cold enough now that it tasted like metal and regret. Brooke wrapped her hands around the mug anyway, the ceramic pressing against the calluses that no amount of time at Seattle General could soften. These hands had held lives. These hands had sewn up wounds in places where the rain tasted like copper and the sky fell at 0300 hours. These hands had worked on men whose names she'd memorized and whose deaths she'd carried out of Helmand Province one at a time like caskets she'd never put down. And they'd done the same thing tonight, held a life that mattered, held the colonel, held him together while his sternum cracked under her compressions like the last thing breaking in a world already broken. But no one who mattered would ever know that. Pierce had made sure of it. He'd built his entire destruction on the foundation of her invisibility. A nurse with no verifiable past, no references he couldn't control, no family who could testify to her character, no military record that could be pulled because officially she didn't have one. She was a ghost with a social security number and a driver's license and absolutely no proof that she'd ever been anything else. And against her, Dr. Pierce was a physician with 20 years of spotless credentials, a reputation built on careful cultivation, allies in administration who owed him favors, a narrative so clean it could pass medical board inspection without a single question. They wouldn't believe her. That was the genius of it. Even if she went to the hospital administrator and explained that Pierce had engineered her humiliation, fabricated her disciplinary reports, deliberately destabilized the colonel to create a crisis he could pin on her incompetence, even if she pulled apart every stitch of his strategy and laid it out in the fluorescent light of an interview room, no one would believe a dismissed nurse with trauma in her eyes and no past to point to. She had no witnesses. She had no documentation he hadn't already redacted. She had no authority, no credentials, no standing. She had only the truth, and the truth, as she'd learned a long time ago in Helmand Province, was the first casualty in every war. The rain kept hammering. Somewhere in this city, Dr. Pierce was probably sleeping the sleep of the righteous, his phone already ringing with concerned calls from colleagues wondering what terrible thing the nurse had done. Somewhere, the hospital administrator was reviewing security footage that Pierce's IT connections had probably already flagged, already contextualized, already turned into evidence of her instability. Somewhere, the colonel was recovering in the ICU while a new nurse, someone properly vetted and appropriately deferential, checked his bandages and did everything according to protocol. And somewhere, she was sitting alone with a cold cup of coffee and a folded flag and the absolute certainty that her life, as she'd constructed it, was over. The clock on the diner wall read 0315 hours. Brooke had 17 hours before Seattle General would officially process her termination. Before Pierce would file the assault complaint with the police. Before the hospital would contact her apartment landlord with a reference request that would somehow result in her eviction. Before every door in this city locked against her because one physician had decided she was a threat. 17 hours to figure out what happened to a captain who no longer existed, to a woman who'd been ordered to vanish, who'd finally found a place where she could almost be human, and who'd just thrown it all away to save a man who'd led her son into the mountains where he died. The diner's neon sign reflected in the window like blood against black glass. She could leave tonight. She could be in Canada by morning, could adopt another name, could become another ghost in another city with another job that required no background check and no references. She'd done it before. The Pentagon had taught her how to disappear the way other people learned their multiplication tables. She could walk out of this diner and never look back, could let Pierce win completely, could let the colonel think that his medic had failed him twice, once in Helmand, once in Seattle. But that wasn't what the flag in her pocket meant. That wasn't what her son's name meant. That wasn't what any of it meant. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking, without making eye contact, understanding on some level that this woman needed silence more than service. Brooke watched the black liquid swirl in the cup, watched it settle, watched it become still. Outside, the rain began to ease. The night was starting its slow turn toward dawn. And somewhere in the next 6 months, everything would change in ways she couldn't predict and couldn't control. But that was the thing about being a warrior, you didn't get to choose when the war came. You only got to choose how you fought it. The security escort had taken her credentials at the exit. The hospital badge with her name, the false name that had become her only identity, they'd collected that without ceremony, without acknowledgement that they were erasing her from the only place she'd been something close to safe. She'd walked out of Seattle General at 02 for 5 hours with nothing but her scrubs, her jacket, the folded flag, and the absolute knowledge that Pierce had won. That his strategy had been perfect. That a fired nurse with no past and no allies would disappear quietly into the city and never be heard from again. That was what he believed. That was what everyone would believe. And for exactly 6 months, Brooke let them. It started with a phone call. Not to her, she ditched her number 3 days after the diner, after the shock had worn off enough that she could think tactically again. But to the hospital. An inquiry from a Marine Corps liaison officer asking questions about a patient recently treated in the ICU, a colonel whose recovery seemed improbable given his initial presentation. Asking about the medical team. Asking about the nurse with the combat knife. asking why the hospital's security footage had been partially deleted and why the supplemental documentation on the patient's crash seemed incomplete. 6 months gave Pierce enough time to settle into his new routine. Enough time for the assault charges to get quietly dropped because the colonel, when asked by police, had declined to press charges and instead requested recognition for the nurse who'd saved him. Enough time for the FBI to quietly open a file on phantom pharmaceutical billing that went back 18 months. Enough time for medical boards in 3 states to start asking uncomfortable questions about his credential transfers and his employment history. Enough time for the Marine IT director with the prosthetic leg to copy every frame of security footage to a secure server before Pierce's connections could delete it. Enough time for the colonel's brother to do his own investigation and uncover the disciplinary notices that had been fabricated. Enough time for someone in the Pentagon to connect the dots between a dying Delta Force colonel and a nurse whose official record didn't exist except in classified files that technically didn't exist either. 6 months later, Brooke stood in the auditorium of Seattle General wearing dress blues for the first time in 3 years. The uniform fit like a memory, like something she'd been and then stopped being, and now was becoming again in front of 200 people who had no idea who she was. The fabric held the weight of her rank and her service and her son's death all at once, and she stood motionless in her composure the way she'd been trained to stand motionless while snipers painted targeting systems across her position. The 2-star general from Fort Sam Houston had traveled to Seattle specifically for this, had cleared his calendar, had shown up with a briefcase full of commendations that hadn't existed officially for 3 years. Bronze Star. He announced it like it was the beginning of something, not the end. Silver Star. The room made sounds, held its breath. 2 purple hearts. He placed each one deliberately on the podium, gave the room time to understand the scale of what they were hearing. And then, Navy Cross. The silence after that wasn't empty, it was full of the weight of things no one would ever fully understand. The colonel stood without assistance. His recovery had been remarkable, the administrator had said in his introduction, a testament to excellent medical care and the patient's own remarkable constitution. But the colonel wasn't looking at the general. He was looking at Brooke. And his eyes held the recognition of a soldier looking at another soldier, the knowledge of someone who'd been brought back from the edge of nothing by hands that knew exactly how to hold him. He placed the folded flag in her hands. The same flag. The one she'd carried for 3 years like a wound she refused to let close. The fabric was soft from her own pressing, from the night she'd held it against her chest while sitting alone in a diner or apartment or a shower where the water could hide her tears. His hands were steady, his voice steady, his uniform perfect in the way of men who'd spent their entire lives building themselves into instruments of precision. "Your son would have been proud, Captain," he said. "He told me about his mother. The medic who could bring anyone back. He didn't know I'd need you to prove it." The room held its breath. No one moved. The general lowered his hand. The colonel's brother wiped his eyes openly, no longer bothering with composure. And Brooke stood motionless in her dress blues with the flag pressed against her chest and her jaw tight enough to crack, her hands finally, allowed to hold something that wasn't a weapon or a secret or a lie. The Marine IT director approached afterward, shook her hand with the grip of someone who'd been in the mountains too, and said only, "Welcome back." By nightfall, Pierce was teaching CPR to community college students for $15 an hour. His medical license was gone, permanently revoked by the state board. His fraud case was still working its way through the courts, the phantom billing codes too extensive, too systematic, too well documented by people who actually knew how to investigate. He'd tried to resign before the official termination, but the hospital administrator had declined the resignation, had insisted on the public record of his dismissal, had made sure every detail went into his file where future employers and boards and investigators would find it. True justice wouldn't be him standing in front of community college students, teaching them how to place their hands on a mannequin's plastic chest. But it was something. It was the end of his ability to hurt people. It was the loss of his power, his authority, his access, his carefully cultivated reputation. It was walking through the world as a person no one respected anymore, as someone whose story changed when you listened to the security footage, as a man whose own handwriting on the medication orders proved he'd been deliberately poisoning patients to create crisis situations he could control. The diner was still there, still neon in the darkness, still serving cold coffee to people who'd made choices that ended them in vinyl booths. But Brooke didn't go back. She went to Seattle General as the clinical director of the ICU, a position the administrator had created specifically for her, a role that came with authority and resources and a desk where she could ensure that no other physician ever systematized harm the way Pierce had. She went to room 4 on her first shift, where a new critical patient was fighting for life, and she checked the monitors with hands that no longer needed to tremble. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. She held it together now, openly, with the weight of her rank and her service and the knowledge that her son would have been proud. She held the colonel's recovery in her careful hands. She held the next patient and the next one, held them all with the precision of someone who'd already survived the worst and found she could do more than survive, she could heal. And the flag stayed in her locker, no longer pressed against her chest, no longer a wound refusing to close. It stayed there as a reminder of what she'd carried, what she'd cost, what she'd finally been allowed to become. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, you know what Brooke Sullivan felt in that diner. Subscribe for more stories of quiet warriors who change everything when everyone stops watching. Like and comment, tell us, would you have saved him, or walked away?